So, and with that, I would like to welcome our first speaker. And the first remote speaker will be Ken Bressie. He will represent the International Cable Protection Committee. And Ken Bressie is also partner with Harris, Wiltshire, and Granis. And so he's the legal advisor to the National Cable Protection Committee, which is a prominent organization, as its name already stands, ensuring and working hard to ensure that cables are protected, it's a bit of a tautological way. Sorry for that explanation. But so, Kent, the floor will be yours to explain what does ICPC do, and then what are the measures that ICPC can take and other stakeholders can take in ensuring that cables are protected. Please, Kent, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tomas, for that very kind introduction. And it's lovely to reconnect with you in this process since we met first many years ago when you were the regulator in the British Virgin Islands. Okay. My thanks also to the Portuguese government for organizing this very important event, and to José Barros for inviting me to participate. I wish that I could have joined in person, particularly given my great fondness for Portugal and the beautiful, beautiful coast that is just north of all of you. But I am joining remotely from Washington this morning. So as Tomas noted, I am the legal advisor for the International Cable Protection Committee, in addition to my private law practice. ICPC is the world's preeminent non-governmental organization, although it has government members focused on submarine cable protection and promoting the rule of law for the oceans, particularly in relation to submarine cables. We work extensively with our leadership and members with other governments, marine industries, and international organizations to promote cable awareness and cable protection, and also peer-reviewed environmental research addressing cables. So these slides are much longer than I'll be able to cover this morning, but they are available, I believe, for your reference going forward. What I'd like to do is outline some general principles for submarine cable protection and resilience, not just protecting cables from damage, but also promoting their robust connectivity. Talk a little bit about what industry does on its own, both during the design phase and the post-installation phase to protect cables, and what industry needs governments to assist with that industry can't do on its own. So in terms of general principles, the ICPC, and more generally, ICPC has put forward a best practices guidelines document, which is available on ICPC's website. And this is about a 12-page document meant to address at a high level key issues and concerns and approaches to cable protection and resilience. And my presentation today reflects that content. In terms of general principles, ICPC believes that governments and industries should be focused on statistically significant risks and focused on risk reduction that can reduce the statistically significant risks. They should promote regulatory environments that promote multiple and diverse connections and transparent regulatory regimes that facilitate both initial permitting and also permits for repairs. It's important that governments consult with industry to understand the technology and changes in the operating environment and operating risks, and that government actions complement industry best practices. Governments should also recognize that laws and policies themselves can sometimes increase the risk of damage, particularly and reduce resilience, particularly if they concentrate cables in a few specific places. Governments should work to promote high seas freedoms that encourage submarine cable deployments, and they should also engage with their peer countries on a global and regional basis. Because what happens elsewhere in the world or in a region can greatly affect an individual country's connectivity. Here briefly is a list of the kinds of threats and risks that we see to submarine cables. Each year, commercial fishing and anchoring account for approximately 70% of cable damage. So in reading the news, you would think that it was all malicious activity and terrorist activity directed at cables, but it's actually much more banal and non-malicious activity like commercial fishing and anchoring that poses threats. But many of these are human activities, but also natural events, earthquakes, tsunamis, and typhoons, underwater landslides. Climate change is becoming an increasing issue for submarine cables with more unpredictable weather, changes in ocean use, and rising sea levels. So industry works very hard to design cables that reduce risks from the outset. The idea is to select the most viable, shortest route and then modify it to avoid features or other ocean activities that pose risks. And there's an elaborate process for route development that's conducted at the beginning. Once systems are installed, there are also a suite of actions that individual cable owners and associated organizations take to try to protect cables, sharing information about the route, educating other ocean users, trying to maintain separation distances from other ocean activities, engaging with commercial fishermen, entering into formal agreements with owners of other infrastructure like pipelines and power transmission cables, and as necessary, pursuing claims for damage, and also promoting robust physical and cybersecurity measures. So industry is not simply resting on its laurels once these systems are installed. There's a lot of activity that goes into cable protection. But these are not sufficient. There are many things that individual operators and their peers cannot do alone. They need the assistance of government with a range of actions. And we're going to take a whistle-stop tour through a few of these, but again, these slides are meant to be reference documents a reference document for you all going forward. Particularly with fishing and anchoring, given that these are the largest threats, there's a lot that governments can do to prohibit fishing in proximity to cables, promote awareness for commercial fishermen, promote the use of designated anchorages for vessels so that they're not dropping and dragging anchors over cables, promoting the use of technology for vessel tracking, which allows for cable operators who monitor their cables around the clock to try to notify coast guards and vessel operators themselves that they may be drifting in proximity to cables. Obviously, there's still work to be done with illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which poses a threat to cables. Spatial separation is the best way to protect cables, but obviously in crowded ocean areas, that can be difficult. ICPC has adopted recommended default separation distances as sort of a starting point with other ocean activities, unless there can be negotiations to be in greater proximity. In some cases, it's an absolute separation requirement that some governments have imposed, but many have not. Some governments have adopted cable protection zones, particularly Australia and New Zealand, which can be options. In the case of Australia, they're mandatory in the case of New Zealand. The danger with requiring that all cables be located in a narrow area is that if you have a vessel dragging an anchor, an underwater landslide or the like, it disconnects or damages all the cables at once. And so requiring clustering is generally not a good idea. The International Hydrographic Organization, which publishes standards and recommendations for nautical charts, which show all submarine cables, or should, has addressed submarine cables specifically with a minimum separation distance of 0.2 nautical miles on either side of the cable, and has also recognized the importance of critical infrastructure and has directed that hydrographic offices and national charting authorities reflect that. It's important for countries to have cable protection laws and allow for both to deter future damage, but also to compensate cable owners for damage to their cables. There's a lot of marine spatial planning activity that can take place. There's been a lot of this in Europe, particularly offshore wind, and there needs to be more of that to make sure that various ocean activities that have spatial requirements are coordinated properly as a policy matter. It's also important because many submarine cable activities are often diffuse and dealt with by many different agencies and ministries to promote a single point of contact. The Singaporean government is probably the best example of a country with its telecom and media regulator, the IMDA, as the single point of contact for anyone but submarine cable issues to start with the government. Governments should also be trying to promote geographic diversity of routes and landings in order to enhance resilience. As I've noted before, there are risks in having everything clustered in particular landings or in particular corridors. And much as many other ocean users would love to have cables all in narrow, limited places, that's not good for connectivity. It's important to have regulatory frameworks that expedite installation and repair and that acknowledge high seas freedoms. Many countries engage in what we call jurisdictional creep, where they try to regulate farther and farther offshore. And that can slow down and make much more expensive and impede system development and repair times. And these should be reduced as much as possible in terms of time and as transparent as possible. I'll finish up here just by noting a few other kinds of restrictions. We don't see these as much in Europe. We see more of this in Asia with cabotage, coastal trading restrictions that require locally flagged vessels to perform installation and repair activities. There aren't that many cable ships that operate globally, and so this interferes very much with the markets that make these services competitive. Port entry requirements can also be disruptive to, particularly with maintenance operations, but also repair. We see some countries be very aggressive in assessing customs duties, taxes, and fees that can deter new systems. Finally, on issues of security, governments increasingly recognize submarine cables as critical infrastructure as a way of highlighting their importance, both from a security perspective, but also in terms of economic preeminence. The ICPC very much supports this, but it also supports sharing of risk and incident data with governments. It's very important that there be ongoing exchanges to talk about gaps in cable protection, but also sharing information about malicious threats by state and non-state actors. And finally, there's a need for states to recognize what is going on the high seas can affect their connectivity, whether it's with activities like deep seabed mining or the ongoing BBNJ negotiations at the United Nations. So I'm sorry for the very quick move through many of these slides, but I'm happy to follow up with any of the participants and, of course, to share these slides with anyone who's interested.
Thank you very much, Kent. So far, thank you. So first of all, a really, impressive load of information. As I say, it's difficult to fit everything in that amount of time, but also shows how comprehensive the frameworks are. So maybe my just quick follow-up question from me, if you don't mind, with this COVID-19 restrictions, and it's like we sometimes talk it from the global perspective, how it restricts globally, impacts the connectivity requirements, but a lot of things you would discuss are very practical about the crews being able to operate and about enter the ports and do the damage, repairs and all that. From ICPC perspective, how did you see that impact? And do you see any good examples of the governments actually adjusting to the COVID-19 situation and enabling good maintenance of cables, which is, I guess, at this stage, at this time, is really critical to have them repaired fast. So, how did it impact you, and do you see any good examples in governments reacting?
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, the pandemic certainly had a significant impact on the submarine cable industry. The ICPC issued a call to action for industry and governments to take particular actions, both to recognize the importance of cables and to try to facilitate installation and repair during the circumstances of the pandemic. One of the biggest challenges was trying to move crew on and off cable ships, as they typically need to transit seaports and airports to join vessels, to leave vessels. Also issues with the supply chain We found many governments very willing to engage, to talk about these issues at a very practical level. We had discussions with numerous governments in Europe, the United States, Asia, and Australia, to name just a few, where there, in spite of other more severe immigration-related restrictions, there were mechanisms set up to ensure that crew could transit with appropriate quarantine provisions, setting up designated quarantine hotels near ports for crews and the like, expediting visas. There's a lot of work that needs to be done and a lot of learning that needs to be taken forward from the pandemic. It's great that governments were responsive to these concerns during the pandemic, but a lot of them continue even in more normal times. And we'd like to make sure that governments learn from the experience.